Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who 50 Years Ago, the show that looks back to the stories that aired in 1973 and looks at the differences between then and now. I'm Ben.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Nick.
This time, we're looking at the Green Death, the news that broke during its transmission in May and June 1973, and the differences between Doctor Who and the world between 1973 and 2023. Firstly, the news. On May the 22nd and May the 24th, scandals in Britain and the US. British scandal number one involves the Under-Secretary of Defence for the Royal Air Force, Lord Lambton, who has photographs of himself with a call girl, behaviour which he describes as credulous stupidity. The Prime Minister, Edward Heath, is reported as saying that he wanted to ensure that the way the UK handled this incident was better than the America's handling of Watergate. Also, May 22nd and May 24th, a second scandal in 3 days saw the Lord Privy Seal and the leader of the House of Lords, Earl Jellicoe, resign over a separate prostitution scandal because he got confused about a building called Jellicoe Hall or House in a notebook about information in the call girl scandal of Lord Lambton. Now, needless to say, if we wanted to go into the various scandals politically in the last 5 years or so, we can say that human impropriety hasn't changed too much.
It's interesting that this sort of scandal has become like the benchmark for modern scandals nowadays when people say, oh, back in the day they would have resigned over something like that. They used to have integrity. And it's weird to see it actually play out and to see, when we were looking at the times for this, it is splashed over the front page for days after this. And nowadays we have the Matt Hancock scandal when he was kissing somebody during the COVID pandemic. But really, I think people only got irritated at that because of the hypocrisy.
And then equally also because we can count the number of scandals on two hands, and that includes the hands of Chris Pincher, who was elevated to the cabinet despite previous misdemeanours by the last Prime Minister but two. The impropriety of which led to the mass resignation of the cabinet and the eventual downfall of Boris Johnson. So, fun and games for Conservative governments 50 years ago and now. At the end of May, Ted Heath goes to Cardiff and says he wants to give more power to Wales. He says that it's in the interest of the nation that the Welsh language should thrive. He says he's appreciated the concern caused by job losses in the steel industry, but, quote, the decisions were not taken lightly, and the country needed to take the opportunity to modernise. Now, if that's not in the forefront of people's minds in Wales when they sit down to watch The Green Death, I don't know what is.
I remember at the beginning of The Green Death, one of the things that the suit says is, we must not be bitter, we must face the facts. And it's like the people of Wales are being told, well, sorry, but that's kind of just how modernisation works. And I think somewhat, at the end of April, the chief economist of the Bank of England said on the podcast called Beyond Unprecedented that everyone needs to accept that they're poorer and stop asking for higher wages, or it's just going to bake inflation into the economy. People took a real dislike to that because obviously it's a man in a suit who is very rich telling you that you got to accept that you're poor. But obviously this is very much a pattern of behaviour throughout history, where people take big decisions that don't immediately make their lives worse, and then tell what one might call the victims to that they had to do it. The decisions were not taken lightly, is the Heath quote there. Um,
Well, you said about the negative portrayal as well here. I think in that scene you're talking about, he's clearly portrayed as they're drawing a parallel to Neville Chamberlain in the Munich conference, aren't they? He has that little piece of paper and he
Yes.
waves it around to the Welsh miners and he's like, "Look, I'm going to make you rich with this piece of paper," and they all initially go scoff at it, and then he goes, "Actually, no, it will make you rich," and they go, "Oh yes, woo!" And then we get to the crux of the whole environmentalist angle of the episode there.
All I did was have to annex Aberystwyth. It's great. Yes. So yeah, we do definitely see the parallels of authoritarian or maybe even corporatist governments doing their very best to control the economy, regardless of the impacts it has on the populace. And we shall see throughout analysing the Green Death contrarian views as to how to organise the world both economically and ecologically. But that's for later on. On the 15th of June, towards the end of the transmission of the Green Death, an organisation for the control of pollution is proposed in the House of Commons. A statement by the Parliamentary Group for World Government says that instead of increasing enclosures under the control of nation states, the oceans should be divided up into blocks. It is immediately criticised by everyone as being unworkable, because people love their naval borders. At the end of the year, MARPOL is passed, which is a landmark agreement from the International Maritime Organization to cut down on pollution from ships. It places restrictions on the dumping of waste, oil, and air pollution.
what I like about these two things is that it shows that there's a sort of a blue sky thinking going on where people are saying, okay, we need to basically, in order to save the world, we need to tear it right down and completely change everything. And then actual change in terms of pollution comes more in terms of documents which suit industry, where it's more like, we will aim for these targets and we will place these restrictions on ourselves, and they argue about the terms for ages. To an extent, when you allow nations and big companies to write the rules, you are presumably more likely to get treaties which are mostly binding and are about targets, and we should really attempt to do this, as opposed to let's carve up the world, which institutional change has always been really slow, but it's always going to be slower when the people making the rules are the people who have to go through all the hoops.
And potentially lose influence and arbitrary power. Indeed, they're more than happy to argue about slices of Antarctica, when in reality, are you really going to do you really want to argue about a slice of very frozen tundra, which is actually now warming up quite fast due to climate change? But who needs logic? So yeah, if we take that realist attitude, looking at the progress, lack thereof of the various COP climate change summits more recently, again, are we saying that not a lot has changed because of the way that the world is trying to run its politics?
I think the changes speak for themselves, by which I mean they're largely silent.
That's a good way of phrasing it. I think watching this episode, it just illustrated how nothing has changed almost in 50 years. It's quite astonishing, actually, and how much of this episode messaging ended up being quite prescient. It gets a couple of bits wrong, but it was quite, in terms of, like the food and things like that, about, they're even thinking about, we can't actually rely on meat anymore. We need to use that for environment, like plant alternatives for environmental reasons. So yeah, and you just sit there and go, the discourse has barely moved on from 50 years ago. depressing to say the least.
And lastly, the news in brief. On the 22nd of May, a High Court judge grants an injunction to East Anglia University, granting them access to a £425,000 computer. 10 computer operators had held the computer hostage, in inverted quotes, in a dispute over pay. On the 28th of May, a group of astronauts gave their first press conference from Skylab. There was a problem with the heating system that they managed to repair. The station was there so that astronauts could do various science things in space. Apparently, the water had too much gas in it, and the crew complained that it made them fart constantly. Luke wrote this. And on the 22nd of May, it's revealed that the top secret laser gun that can shoot missiles at long range is being worked on by the, I presume, UK government.
Yeah.
10 years before Reagan's Star Wars initiative, the Ministry of Defense says that they're working with the Americans on that idea. And just in case any lasers are currently pointed at our recording locations, I'm going to move swiftly on and say that was the news. And now we shall look at the Green Death's principal themes and any differences or similarities that spring up in this story and Doctor Who and the world then and now. We've got the themes of environment and humanity's place in it, change and growth, and faceless corporations versus the man. Firstly, on environment and humanity's place in it, immediately we retreated in the Green Death to Tweety birds in the background against the Global Chemicals Research Centre, and the fact that this story principally is about maggots giving the Green Death and attacking humanity.
I'm going to attempt to somewhat contextualize the Green Death in terms of eco-fiction, as it was called, in the 70s. So, eco-fiction was a term coined in the 70s because a compilation of eco-fiction came out in 1971. When I say it was a compilation, it took some stories which had already been published, short stories from the 20s through to the 60s, and said, we need to start talking about this. And if you read the introduction, it's so interesting because Stadler says stuff like, we're trying to draw attention to this issue. We've been silent for too long. And it's really about, we need everyone to start talking about this as though no one has actually been talking about it before. And if you look at the first appearance of Poison Ivy, the Batman villain in the 60s, she's basically just a femme fatale, and she's kind of portrayed as like an eco-terrorist. But she's no longer considered a villain if you watch the Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy TV show. So eco-fiction is just getting its start around this time. It's so weird that at this point, this sort of thing has only just started. I mean, I'm going to quote from that introduction again. People aren't listening to scientists. Will they listen to writers? They're taking action. He just wants people to understand. Don't be paralysed by the vastness. Would you say that the Green Death kind of fits that bill, where they're saying people aren't listening to scientists, will they listen to writers, and not to be paralysed by the extremeness of the situation?
I partly would. Ultimately, there's the whole wheel community, and we take a good minute and a half to show that people from different backgrounds have joined together in this community to be the voices of that for want of a better term, silent majority, the one Nixon used to win the 1968 presidential election. Only this time it's a silent majority, i.e., the whole of humanity, who want a long-term future on the planet Earth that has been imperiled by the outputs of an industrial revolution and 2 world wars, basically.
Am I right in thinking that what you're saying, Luke, is that this is the first time? Let me just clarify. Is this the first time that this has been brought up in fiction, or are you saying this is a continuation of what's been built up over the 40 years beforehand?
What I'm saying is that between the 20s and the 60s, that there had been short stories written, but nobody really taken any notice. When this book, Eco Fiction, comes out in 1971, people actually start to care, and we get more of an eco-friendly message in fiction.
Right, okay. I mean, I suppose that in itself just shows how it's taken essentially 100 years for it to get to a point of 50 years ago, it was just starting to get a hearing. Now it's got a hearing, but it's about 50 years too late.
And influence is still very much limited.
Yeah, well, it doesn't help when the episode just tells you the planet's dead. I mean, I suppose that's not entirely incorrect, but this was at least, it had all its political stuff in the first episode, and then we went on from there.
The whole illicitly offsetting pollution into maggots in a mine, pumping waste in there from its oil production to fuel mutations, which ultimately become deadly insects. And instead, the solution is fungus and toadstools to feed the world.
I mean, in that sense, though, there was a lot of it that, obviously being a 50-year-old production, some of it's dated, but certainly the whole we need to live off of fungi as a future source of food, of protein, that's no longer meat because that's not sustainable. Was anyone else saying that at this point in time? I feel like that's a fairly modern thing. I feel like, I don't know, do you know about this, Luke?
Well, that's the sign that struck me about the portrayal of the Brigadier, that he's all sneering like, oh, I'd rather have a slice of beef rather than this fungus. But the fungus actually tastes like beef, and they're able to change this into various other foodstuffs. Let me just check when corn comes out, because I think corn comes out around this time.
And
corn comes out in 1985? Wow, okay.
So this is quite ahead of its time. Like, watching it, it's just like, I mean, I know it's obviously in this era, it's a bit unclear exactly when it's meant to take place. It's in the near future. However near that future is never been elaborated on. And of course, it ends up with the unit dating controversy, but that's somewhere we shan't go. So in that sense, it was quite forward thinking, and I was quite impressed. And yeah, I don't recall this being a topic of conversation really to the last 10 years about diet needing to really reform to help climate change. But that's one thing that's conspicuously absent is climate change. It's all about pollution, about just, toxic sludge and whatnot, as opposed to greenhouse gases. That's conspicuously absent. While it is for like a petrochemical plant, they don't mention carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases at any point. They just say about the sludge. And that's where you can tell this is kind of like very much at the beginning of awareness in a greater form about climate. Because even then, they don't even mention the climate at all. They say the environment, but they don't talk about the climate as something that is being affected here long term. So yeah, pollution. Well, pollution will be quite localized and won't destroy the whole planet potentially. You can have the most vile, disgusting plant, but if it's just pumping out sludge and it can be localized, it doesn't really affect the whole climate. So it's almost like they haven't quite got there with the science yet. So, or at least not the awareness of the science, because I'm pretty sure by this point, climatologists were aware of what was going to happen,
Oh yeah.
but it just wasn't public knowledge.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is
At this point, we'll bring up the primary source for the Green Death, which is a piece in the magazine The Ecologist, titled "The Blueprint for Survival," in which the authors recognised that society could face a succession of famines, epidemics, social crises, and wars, or change willingly, recognising that indefinite growth cannot be sustained by finite resources, fearing the impact of chemicals on the ecosystem of the world, and the potential solution being smaller communities which are less industrial. And this idea gets bandied about basically during various economic crises of the late 80s, early 90s, the financial crash of 2008, and so on and so forth.
I somewhat remember a Jeremy Clarkson column from, I believe it was the late 2000s, maybe early 2010s, in which he says that the world will not be changed by people going backward. It will be changed by going forward, and, as he put it, the lost British art of invention. Or it's a very similar quote to that. And I can definitely see how people would read such a proposal and panic, because it's saying, let's just wind society back. I mean, to a lot of people, they would only have just got there. Like, we think about the rate of change between the 40s and the 70s. In a generation, it was a massive change. And I also think about that Marpole thing that we talked about during the news. Big, dramatic changes are never going to resonate with policyholders, and they are not going to resonate with companies either. This sort of proposal was so obviously doomed, but so massively popular, possibly just because it was blue sky thinking.
Utopian ideals, really. Ultimately, it's a case of trying to change the mindset. So you talk about Clarkson's mindset there of driving forward technological change. It's forwards rather than going backwards. It's more technology rather than not in my backyard thinking.
Do you remember the air zone solution when they start saying the future is the way forward? When they're talking about that they bring out that chick with the gills, and everyone's like, "Whoa, there's connections with bizarre trash." Sorry, I cut you off, but that's
no. That's fine.
My head.
If I go further back, that's 1993. Let's go back to 1964 and the Daleks' comment of, "We do not have to adapt to the environment. We will change the environment to suit us and pump a lot of more radiation onto Skari." A Doctor Who's more than happily confronted environment and the potentials for change. It's not a case of forwards or backwards. It's a case of sideways in slippage, in terms of changing your mindset and changing society's view on things, I suppose. But doing it through the established mediums of television and radio and stuff that we've come to enjoy because of the 20th century's technological advancements and its altering effect on society.
Before we move on, I want to talk about the maggots slightly in the context of environmentalism. What I think one of the best things about the maggots, in terms of like a subliminal thing in the story, and I don't know if they intended this, is that what they keep saying is, what are these maggots going to hatch into? There's a lot of fear about the future. Obviously, there's that line where they say, wholesale pollution of the countryside, and that's all the stakes are. But it's really good to me in terms of its messaging, that it's not about what we're seeing now, it's about when it starts to spread and hatch. And I've kind of thought about this story, that the fact that pollution kind of has to be something you need to shoot at with a gun because it's Doctor Who in the 70s is kind of a problem with the story. But at the same time, it is pretty good that there is that fear of what will happen, which is pretty on the money in terms of environmental messaging, because it's all about we need to do something now to protect the future. Maybe it was a subconscious thing, but I thought on rewatch that actually turns out to be a pretty good way of approaching it.
Well, and you say that as well on rewatch. What was a very again prescient line was the I've forgotten his name, but the company director.
Stevens.
He rubbishes the doctor. Yes. In his meeting with the doctor demands when the brigadier is ordered by the prime minister to blow up the mines, and he's having the meeting, and he goes, he's completely incredulous to him, and he is well. We know later on why that's the case, and in fact that as well ties into being quite effective with, in hindsight, watching it back from 50 years hence, about essentially the polluting companies telling anyone fighting for green causes you're insane and you're over dramatizing things, and then you find out that's exactly what the carbon lobby has done for decades, has made people who fight for green causes look like crazy people and slated them in the media. And then they've actually been found out to be totally on the money.
Mm.
And it's quite interesting to see so early on that this was already being touched upon. This is where it feels quite depressing almost to watch this and see how we've not progressed nearly as much as this piece really would have hoped that we would have.
And now we shall look at faceless corporations versus the man as a theme. We've already talked about global chemicals supported by governments, by extension unit, and the media versus Professor Jones and Joe and co. And that's a Nobel Prize winner who gets coverage in the press. What lot of good that does for the ordinary Welsh folk who need jobs. The doctor's being partly establishment by going on his pleasure jaunt to Metebelis free, rather than putting his greed for knowledge and adventure aside to help the common man eventually. And then we get the boss of global chemicals processing people into the establishment to help cover up the pollution.
I would say that boss is like the crux of this whole thing to me. Like, he's not really a computer in like the Wotan kind of sense from the War Machines. Instead, he's more kind of like a metaphor for a cold, calculating boss who doesn't care. Kind of like the suit at the beginning who says, we must not be bitter, we must face the facts. He's kind of everyone's fear of a boss who just says, well, it's very sad that we're going to have to cut your pay, but that's what the graph says. He is the graph boss.
I mean, yeah, I agree with you, Luke. It's definitely like AI is not the point of this. It's not. It doesn't get into that at all, and in the sense of using it as a sci-fi concept, that it just sort of just chucks it out there. Almost to the point that it makes me think it's almost disappointing, because it's like the fault of what's happening is the computer. But then you realize, and you think back and you go, okay, it's actually at root still a human problem, because there's no, unlike a lot of Doctor Who, there's no hint of alien intervention in this episode at all, or in the serial, I should say. So, although it's the computer who's running the show now, it was invented by humans. So it's still at root a human fault for the environmental catastrophe that's unfolding.
And the computer does say repeatedly about its creators. It says like, oh, my creators thought it was amusing. I think it's fitting. He's kind of a mustache-twirling villain who is created by nerds.
Yeah, absolutely. Boss is linked to Stevens' brain. It adds human to that machine and gives it both grandeur and insanity. It's a musical Germanic mixed metaphor fanatic. And let's face it, the corporatists of the 1930s, which is basically one step away from fascism, liked efficiency too.
But if we were then to compare this to the current day, it's not. Yes, the mustache twirling's a bit dated, but then you think about modern day iterations of AI, and there's a bit of a scare about AI now as we talk or recording. And it's like, actually, the way that supposedly, allegedly, ChatGPT and other such chatbots online can be affected by human interaction, it wouldn't be unsurprising that you could mold an AI into becoming a mustache twirling villain. So again, this is where this serial becomes quite prescient and ahead of its time, doesn't it?
Well, actually, we do have a historical attestation of that. I believe it was a few years ago, in like the mid 2010s or something, where there was this one chatbot put online, and it was taking in feedback from the people who were writing into it. And within about 24 hours, it became horribly racist and anti-Semitic. So, I mean, yeah, that there is historical precedent for such a thing happening. And one must assume to an extent that people ruined that AI chatbot simply for the lols. So, to an extent, maybe it's just that we can't have nice things kind of problem.
Well, equally, we couldn't have nice things with certain technological advancements and the creation and blossoming of social media into what its current form is, which is the enhancement of the loud nature of people maintaining views which are aiming to restrict the liberties and rights of others, and then suddenly certain people who want attention buy said social media platforms and make it into an even worse venture of discourse. And so if you're going to give AI that, then God knows what it's going to blossom into.
The mans in this episode, Elgin, who's the nice suit, he's in a grey suit, whereas everyone else is in black suits, because they're the evil ones. Yates is also in a black suit, but I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe it's just because he's kind of portrayed as part of the problem in this episode, or in this series.
He is the plant. He's there to infiltrate the establishment, but the establishment then try to make him become, quote, the slave elite, having resisted the processing thanks to the doctor, but he manages to escape. You've also got other establishment versus the man ideals. You get the witty repartee between the milkman and the brigadier, both the milkman and the cleaner outfit becoming Pertwee's disguises. Again, more of the man infiltrating the establishment to bring it down. And in some cases, the establishment has seemed to be so powerful that Elgin gets replaced by Mr. James and absolutely nobody bats an eyelid, despite the real-life reason for the change in actors.
We've got to talk about the presentation of the government in this episode. The ecology minister is portrayed, I would say, as well-meaning, but misinformed, and then eventually is able to put the boot down on Unit and the Doctor simply by kind of being in the pocket of big chemicals. It's very much of that yes minister kind of era, where these politicians are not portrayed as evil, they're still portrayed as upstanding members of society. Even though we've got these scandals going on at the moment, it is still going to take some time for that sort of establishment to really take the hit. And it's also going to take some time for news media to really be able to get its hits in as well. the government is portrayed as well-meaning, but it's still going to throw its weight around. It does all that stuff to the coal miners, which of course starts this whole thing off, and it's obviously in the pocket of the polluting companies. But they still come off relatively well in this episode, would you say?
Was almost underdeveloped. We have that a couple of instances where it's mentioned, and then obviously we have the scene where we get to see the cabinet the cabinet room with the Prime Minister, his head, back of his head to the camera, and we can see the Ecology Minister. But it's an underdeveloped point. So I don't know if so much they're not portrayed badly as more just a case of it's just not portrayed at all, or it's, as I say, underdeveloped. What I find interesting here is, though, talking about not portraying them as badly as they are now, the company, he has a little spiel, Stevens, about the what they want to do, and I suppose the politicians, as you said, this makes them look less bad, parrot it about, it's a cheap and clean energy source, and the brigadier sort of parrots it, oh yes, cheap oil, that'd be great, and it's like, yes, we do see the negative side of it, but it's not and yes, it is pollution, but it's a more abstracted form of pollution. It's sludge, as opposed to CO2 in the air. And it's almost like the way it portrays the positive side of it is that there's true positives to having oil still, as opposed to, as we now know, is like there's not really any positives to it other than we've just developed technology to use it, and it's just expensive to change anything else, because there's no inherent positives of using oil as an energy source now, and we know that. But viewing this, it feels like it thinks there might be.
What do we think of the portrayal of pollution and the government in this story, and the portrayal of such in the other Pertwee story, in which a source of cheap energy underground causes problems by glowing green, and a maniacal guy who is in touch with the government starts to get power over the facility that it's in and causes a massive mess called Inferno. Well, I don't know why they made the same story twice, but how would we say that this story compares and contrasts that portrayal with that one? I mean, in Inferno, what was it? Mr. Keith, Sir Keith, is portrayed as the nice guy who's kind of standing up to Starman, but there is also very much the sense of this is something that the country needs. In this story, there is very much the sense of this is what the country needs, but the civil servants, people like Mike Yates, are a lot less powerful in this one.
I'd say that the Moho project, I don't know why I'm calling it that, but of Inferno is definitely more a government-controlled project, which is probably why you get civil servants like Sir Keith being in charge of it and saying yes or no to it when it's discovered that actually, tapping into the resources of the Earth's energy can just cause the world to explode, and does in the alternate universe. Whereas here, the world has changed not a lot in 2 years, but to the point where this is now a fully private venture by Global Chemicals, sanctioned by the government. And so you're really starting to see capitalism rearing its ugly head in this section. But I would compare and contrast it more with the next eco-terrorism story, which is Invasion of the Dinosaurs, where you get Mike Yates going absolutely nuts and wanting to take Britain back to a golden age before the smoke and pollution, making sure that nightingales in Berkeley Square can live with the dinosaurs in peace. And Malcolm Hulke takes that and goes, yeah, the problem is humans are greedy.
Well, that's something that somewhat. I was thinking about this earlier when Nick was talking about the problems faced 50 years ago and now when you try and stand up to power, but there's too much money involved and they shut you down. Hulk is very right. The issue is more that when there's lots of money being thrown around and lots of power being bandied about, people are not going to be so willing to give up that power and they're going to resist it. You know, perhaps to an extent, people are always just trying to live their lives with the most comfort they can, no matter what social class that they're in. But yeah, the problem is that humans are greedy.
Again, it gets to the end goals of the objectives of global chemicals being efficiency, productivity, and profit at all costs. And the ultimate final quote that disease and deaths are sad necessities. And the solution to that was to blow it all up. And the other theme within the Green Death is change and growth. We see that through Joe Grant, who wakes up to fight pollution whilst Dr. Gallivant's off the Metabolus free, and her idealism has developed and grown during her part in the show, learning from the Doctor's science and space-time travelling for fun, and then takes it and puts it into Professor Jones's campaigning and Amazon tripping for environmental purposes, and she's still doing it to this day as a sort of eco-warrior. She initially adjusts her behaviour to understand Professor Jones's youthful and non-conformist ways, having been with the equally non-conformist but still supported by the establishment unit-etile Doctor.
That's weird that you took that away from that. Well, it's not weird. It's, you know, you did it. But I kind of took away that Jo hadn't really changed. Like, I saw her being portrayed kind of as a bumbling moron again, where she walks into Dr. Jones's study and sits on a mushroom and goes, oh, I'm so sorry. And while she's trying to clean it up, she smacks into something else, and it's all very Laurel and Hardy. Like, my takeaway was more that, you know, maybe she's at this sort of stage of Doctor Who kind of just a bunch of character traits, and bumbling moron is one of them. So what would...
Yeah. Clumsiness is definitely part of Jo's character, because we're still seeing it in the Season 9 Blu-ray trailer and the Sarah Jane Adventures and what have you. But it's better than the Doctor's arrogance that you see in John Pertwee's incarnation. And it's more of an acceptable human trait as opposed to the alien detachment of the Doctor trying to lecture humanity to do better, whereas Jo's going to be clumsy, but with her heart in the right place to try and save the world and be nice to sea devils and Ogrons. Whereas the Doctor's going to karate chop it.
I suppose so, yeah. And she's starting to value the Doctor's values by going off with Professor Doctor whatever, what's his face, Jones at the end.
I was thinking to compare this to, you know, more current Doctor Who, more modern Doctor Who. This is one of the first more modern style companion exits in the sense of there's more emotion to it. You know, in the 60s, a companion would leave and the Doctor essentially would make one remark about it or no remarks, and then that's it. It's never acknowledged. Here, it's like there's a good half an episode or a good 10 minutes, something like that, where it's clear she's going and the Doctor's actually quite upset and they do really hold on it. And the episode ends on the Doctor being sad and purposefully leaving early, which is notable, I'd say, for Doctor Who at this point in time, and makes this feel like a more modern companion exit than other, because there are companions after this as well that also don't get this treatment. So and you do feel a pang of emotion, which the show doesn't normally at this point do. You can kind of tell that early on, don't they? They mention, oh, he's like you, but if you were younger, sort of thing. She says,
Mm.
Joe says to the Doctor. So it's like, one, it's nice that we're saying that the Doctor's like, or John Pertwee's far too old for Katie Manning to be going out with, so that's nice. Um,
Hmm.
um, it's refreshing for something so old as this to say that an old man can't get with a young woman. That's refreshing that something 50 years ago got that right. And two, yeah, it's suggesting almost a romantic thing going on there between the archetype character of the Doctor. If he was younger, they would have something going on romantically, which obviously we know now in the modern show happens all the time. So yeah, I feel like that's the is this the first time we've had sort of a acknowledged in the show quite as openly as this almost romantic element?
I'd say yes.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that's possibly due to the behind the scenes on the show. So when you've got Terrence Dicks and Barry Letts working on this whole thing, like people have said before that the Pertwee era could almost be a separate show called Unit, as opposed to, I don't know, say Derrickshire and era, where it's like one and done things every week. In this part of the show, Terrence Dicks can look forward and say, right, okay, we're going to sort of plan this sort of story arc, which is kind of how modern shows are being run.
Hmm. I mean, we don't call it the unit family for nothing. In that they grow together throughout series 8, season 8, 9, 10, and then we slowly but surely detach with the untimely death of Roger Delgado, the departure of Katie Manning, and then John goes, and then unit just sort of disappears away, and we move on back to the sort of Derek Sherwin ideal for Tom's era.
I mean,
So yeah,
this sort of showrunner setup isn't unique for Doctor Who at the time, though. I mean, you could point to all sorts of shows. I mean, the one that comes to mind is like Blake Seven, as one person behind it who's kind of got this big serialized idea in his head. It's just interesting that when this does happen, the episode is more able to focus on that sort of bit of the companion leaving. I mean, you can think about something like the War Games, which is also similarly emotional, but it's not like the entire serial builds up to it, or Fury from the Deep, where it's like there's kind of a hard cut and everyone's eating a roast dinner, and then Victoria says, "I would like to stay here," and then the Doctor says, "Oh yes, I shall miss her." When you're doing it this way, it's obviously going to lead to a bit more cohesion.
The change and growth of the show as it gets to its 10th anniversary has the ability to show change and growth in the companions that last for multiple seasons. I mean, Jo at this point is second only to Jamie in terms of companion tenure.
Is she?
Oh,
I suppose that makes sense.
In terms of 3 full seasons, whereas Jamie's longer because the episodes were longer, so to speak. So yeah, ultimately the change and growth of Jo Grant continues. You could argue through Planet of the Spiders, when the Doctor's last foisted gift onto her in terms of the Mythopoeus crystal is returned via post to the Doctor, going, "Yeah, I don't need this. This is causing me all untold bad luck. Use it as a Deus Ex Machina for your final story, please." Which it sort of does in here.
To an extent, I think the story is kind of self-defeating and sad, because at the end, I mean, they say, "Oh my god, this fungus is going to save the world." Jo and Jones are going to go off to, what is it, like Chile or somewhere like that, to save
Brazil, the Amazon rainforest.
Oh, it's in Brazil. Oh, okay. And they are going to save the world, but obviously they don't, because the world still sucks. So when the veil of fiction is lifted, and you're watching it for a history podcast, it did kind of make me sad. But I mean, obviously, Joe Grant, the fictional idea, did not affect policy making in the 1970s too much.
Because the policy making of the real world doesn't have some kind of massive tectonic figure to say that everything got magically fixed. Which is why we're currently in the places we currently are here in the 2020s. Yeah. I will wrap this slowly up with backup info from my complete history collection. This whole Green Death drama, in inverted commas, about environmental issues was brought on from Barry Letts's view from reading The Ecologist, wishing to portray a series about the fight between development and humanity's well-being without espousing full, in quotes, hippie tendencies. His belief in Buddhism does not come into it. The Whole Wheel community was inspired by a New Scientist article in January 1973 on a community in Wales developing a social system that was non-polluting and did not use natural resources. And finally, a chemical company in Uxbridge, which was a UK subsidiary of a Californian multinational, complained to the BBC about similarities it saw in global chemicals, between global chemicals and itself. The BBC responded by saying, "Doctor Who does not attempt to portray reality." But we would argue in this history podcast that you can see similarities and differences in how Doctor Who portrays real things and potential future things, both in 1973 and in the present day. That was the third season of Doctor Who 50 years ago, the podcast that looks back to the episodes that aired back then and looks at the differences between then and now. The audio version of this podcast is on iTunes. Leave positive comments there, it helps. Like, comment and subscribe on YouTube. We're on Facebook also. Doctor Who 50 years ago may return, perhaps with season 13. Until then, I've been Ben.
I've been Luke.
And I've been Nick.
Thank you, and goodbye.